Welcome to the Policy Geopolitics Dev Room. Thank you for showing up in such large numbers. I wasn't expecting this to be a full house, but I will be talking about software supply chain security, which is a somewhat technical thing about cybersecurity and the field that I work in. But I'll be looking at the policy aspects of it, and I want to benchmark India and where we stand and what are the missing aspects that other countries are doing, which India is not doing, etc., etc. Uh, I'm Nemo. I do tech and security things. I built this project called End of Life Date, which is very much in like software supply chain security things. If you've never heard of software supply chain security, this is how we typically define it. Is this idea that someone else can introduce nefarious code into trusted software before it gets delivered somewhere else. The way it impacts primarily open source software, but also other softwares, is via attacks that get fairly popular. SolarWinds is the largest example. I'm sorry, I forgot to start my timer. SolarWinds was a large-scale attack where a large cybersecurity vendor called SolarWinds was breached, and because they were a vendor to other companies, they essentially gave out software to other companies. All these companies trusted that piece of software. When that piece of software was breached, all these other companies got breached, and it resulted in like huge impact across the entire industry. Similarly, other places have happened where, for example, Wipro got breached a while ago, and because Wipro consultants had access to all of the companies that they were consulting for, the software that they were running everywhere got breached, and all these other companies got impacted as a result. So the impact is fairly big. The industry is estimating roughly like 100 billion-ish worth of revenue loss every year or so in terms of impact, and it is expected to keep going up every year. The other part is it has the capacity to impact critical infra in much more worse terms compared to like regular attacks. And we have already seen like other forms, like ransomware attacks have been there for a while, malware attacks have been there for a while, but this adds additional problems such as a virality factor. In the early computer days, you might have heard of worms, which would just self-replicate themselves, and software supply chain, which is this idea that I build a piece of software, I give it to you, and it might be just an open source package, or maybe it's Debian, and then you use it to build something, and you ship it to somebody else, and it's a software supply chain that we are building out together. And this introduces virality factor because some points may be load bearing. They may run software that goes into thousands and thousands of places, and that introduces additional risk. Uh, and we have an $8 trillion open source economy, gift economy, as Chad calls it, which is, I can click the slideshow button now, which is running on top of all of us volunteers. And all of this software supply chain security is coming to open source developers from two angles. One is regulatory pressure, because a lot of breaches have happened and governments are now interested in it. So there's like a lot of policy impact that is happening. And that is squeezing open source from the other side, because now these policies that will get set will have impact at the end of the day on not just businesses, but also potentially developers like us. So I want to cover both these things, but primarily focusing on regulations and entities. And as you can imagine, these people love their acronyms. This is the list of acronyms that are currently in process or being shipped out in various shapes and forms to define cybersecurity stuff, supply chain security stuff specifically. Cybersecurity partnership agreement is a quad agreement, and we'll expand the acronyms. There are basically a national cybersecurity strategy of the USA, which is currently pushing some limits into what the industry should be following in terms of supply chain security, best practice, etc. There's a work in progress, Securing Open Source Software Act, which also mandates a lot more things. This is currently not yet passed, but it's introduced in Congress. CRA and PLD are two directives from the European Union, and similarly NIS, which is the Network Information Security Systems 2 Act, which also like European Parliament is pushing things top down through legislation, and they don't really have most things are coming by the European Parliament, which means they're legislative acts. Then NCTA is from Canada, which is also, it is more from a threat assessment perspective, less from a supply chain security perspective. And India has CCRF, Cyber Security and Cyber Relations Framework, which you will not imagine, but comes from SEBI. So this is the rough lay of land where different entities are like trying to tackle this problem together in different shapes and forms, right? DORA is also another act from European Union, which is trying to push similar directives, but more focused towards financial agencies. In SEBI, the CCRF is currently being pushed out by SEBI, and it only applies to the regulated entities under SEBI, of course. So what do they all do? And these are like the 6 kind of pillars that we are dealing with here. First is disclosure and cooperation. Cybersecurity in general as a field requires this kind of thing where if an attack happens, you want input from not just the government, but also the entire industry and the people who are being impacted to raise their voice and say, hey, you know what, we have been hit by an attack. And the people who can help you and they can show up and say, hey, these are the indicators of compromise. These are things you can use to actually prevent these attacks. So there's a lot of disclosure and cooperation. So one of the things that, for example, the joint partnership agreement in the Quad agrees upon is, hey, we will coordinate cyber attacks and coordinate standards to help us exchange information and exchange threat vectors and so on. Then the two things that are in interest to supply chain security are SBOMs. SBOM is the biggest buzzword in like the internal cybersecurity space these days. It stands for Software Bill of Materials. It's this idea that if I'm giving you a piece of software, and the term comes from hardware, where if you ship a device, you typically give a bill of materials alongside it. So if I give you a piece of software, I'm supposed to give you a software bill of materials alongside it. So for example, if I'm building something on top of Debian 12 and that is running, let's say, Inkscape, and I ship it as an appliance to you as a graphic designer, I'm supposed to tell you, hey, this is running Debian 12 and this is running Inkscape 12.x. And I give this to you in a nice machine readable document, which you can now use. And this like tiny innovation has enabled a lot of additional resilience in the sector, essentially, because now at any point, the person who has a list of all these documents can search these documents and find out, hey, Debian 12 is now going away. Am I impacted? They can just search these documents, their SBOMs, and find out if they are impacted or not. So SBOM is one of those important levers that, for example, CISA has been pushing through in the US, CCRF has been pushing through, CERT has been pushing through. SDLC is like how you develop software development lifecycle things, and a lot of vulnerability assessments and things like finding out whether the software you are building is vulnerable or not because of known software supply chain attacks. So, for example, you found out that Debian is vulnerable. You need to actually look at your documents. So, having those processes in place, this is also being mandated. So, for example, the CRA and a few other things mandate, if you know that there's something that is being exploited in the wild, you must patch it before you ship your software. And this is essentially being mandated via.
Sorry to disturb you, but I had a question. Is there any current alert system that lets people know, or is there any way that if you are relying on set of, if you have your own software build materials, if there is an exploit happening and it has been reported in a vulnerability data,
Yes.
I could pull from that and.
Yes, so there's two things. One is obviously CVs. CVs is common vulnerability enumerant, and this is like the started via US agencies, but now it is currently the world standard for knowing exploitable, for knowing vulnerabilities in software. So, for example, Debian has its own list of CVs and so on. But a level above that, because CVs are very common, you'll not necessarily know if someone is actually exploiting us. There's this idea of a known exploitable vector, KEV. And the current nodal agency that has been pushing these out is primarily CISA, I believe. But there's also other agencies that are pitching in, especially with like the US geopolitical climate being, we want to only care about ourselves. So I think EU CERT has also been stepping in. But the idea is, and these are like public data currently, so you can just subscribe to KEVs and get notified accordingly. KVs and CERT, essentially, like KV is the main important thing you need to know. All right, but basically, if you people and regulations want you to push heavily into SDLC to actually look for these kind of threats beforehand. Then there's guidance for critical sectors. Obviously, like cybersecurity is always like where are the priority linchpins in our industry, like finance, energy, etc. So guidance to critical sectors is something that all countries are like focusing towards because that is where they feel the threat is the highest. There's liability directives that are coming in. PLD is the one in Europe, but basically it says if you ship a software that is vulnerable, and if, for example, you are mandating warranty for it, so you are liable for support. If it breaks, if it is insecure, you are liable in that sense. And the last lever that regulators typically have is government contracts. Governments in most countries are one of the biggest purchasers of software. And as a result, they can use standards on what software they buy versus what they don't buy. The biggest example of this is FedRAMP. FedRAMP is the federal regulation in the US, which sets a standard for how companies can sell software to the US federal government. It ends up, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but it ends up being adopted by various states as well. And FedRAMP has things, it has a regularly updated standard. It has things like audits and compliances of not just security, but other things as well. So, for example, if you want to run a cloud service for a US federal agency, you have to comply to FedRAMP. There's no other way. And this becomes like a big lever to actually get companies to have the kind of security that they want. So FedRAMP, for example, is pushing more and more things about software supply chain security. One of the big important things CISA has been pushing for federal this is you need to, this was I think, a US executive order where they mandated SBOMs. and this was like the first thing that happened, I think, post SolarWinds a year later, where we really want SBOMs for all software that the government purchases. And that has made like the huge industry shift happen across the board, because now all cybersecurity vendors have started caring about SBOMs. So now, irrespective of whether you're selling to the government, the vendors already support it. So now you as a business can use it. Uh, Indian regulatory landscape is there's three-ish agencies that have been looking into SBOMs, software supply chain security assets so far. One is Certain, which has pushed out a SBOM white paper, which is not really their job, to be honest. They've taken existing, whatever the SBOM landscape looks like currently, and they pushed out a white paper on how things can, but it is very, it is not really CERT's job, in my opinion. SEBI has pushed out a SCRF, which is the regulation framework for their regulated entities. So if you're a regulated entity under SEBI, you're now mandated by it. I think the deadline was pushed, but now it is already live and since August this year. And it includes things like SBOMs. So if you're a regulated entity, you have to maintain and keep a track of SBOMs and then check those SBOMs against known vulnerabilities and see if you can patch, etc. NCIPC is the National Critical Infrastructure Protections Agency, and they've been pushing out some guidelines around SBOMs and some guidelines on supply chain security. And they've been pushing an interesting thing called a common assessment framework, which is this government contract lever, where there's idea that if you are a national NCIPC mandated agency of any sort, in order to get an assessment done for cybersecurity onboarding, earlier every agency will have its own. So they're trying to like merge all those standards together and requirements together into a common assessment framework. I don't think it is like mandated yet in terms of law, etc. But they are trying their best. And the problem, like this is decent, but you can already see gaps, right? What are regular businesses to do? What are like a biggest pain point? What we have seen in the industry, for example, retail vendors get hit hardest, right? They might come to a standstill. Airlines have been hit. So like there are lots of missing gaps. And the problem for that is the Indian cybersecurity regulatory landscape, which is we have a lot of people putting their hand in the pot, and everyone wants their share of pie, or like there's just too many cooks. So there's some kind of turf war that happens in the Indian cybersecurity regulatory landscape, from what I understand. There's the NCSC, which is under the PMO office, I4C, which is the Cyber Crime Coordination Center under MHA. There's the Defense Cyber Agency under Ministry of Defense, Certain under MITI, and other agencies, I believe, have laid claim to actually taking over Certain. And then the Ministry of External Affairs has the Cyber Diplomacy Division, and there's a few more. And there is no clear nodality for, US has a clear central agency called CISA, which tries to coordinate all these kind of interesting things. And NSCSC is supposed to do some of those things, but it hasn't happened yet so far from what I've seen in the industry. Like CISA is fairly active in actually reaching out to companies and making sure what needs to be done. For example, they have an effort to stop ransomware attacks in the US. There's no anything parallel close that is coming in India. So policy directions, I'll run through this quickly. There's a national cybersecurity reference framework that was been in draft for, I think, a couple of years now. It still hasn't gone into effect. It tackles some of those things, but it's already out of date from the last draft, because like a lot of supply chain security things that have shown up in the last few years, it's already... NCIPC is doing its best, but it's not enough because it has a smaller mandate, and the National Cybersecurity Coordination Center needs to step up a little. Certain needs funding. Certain is this tiny agency which you can see is trying to stretch itself thin. It is supposed to mandate. It's supposed to be the nodal agency for all cybersecurity stuff, but it is A, underfunded, and B, like trying to figure out its ambit as well. And other agencies are trying to lay claim. So we need to actually fund CERT to be able to do the interesting kind of things that need to happen to coordinate cyber security threats and push out more knowledge, information sharing, etc. Maybe we need to take CAF a level up, because NCIPC is pushing it to have a smaller mandate. Maybe we need to take it a level up to actually apply to more stuff, like somewhat like FedRAMP. BIS has been missing in this entire picture. A lot of the way US does this, for example, is NIST is the standard setting body, which sets the standards for cybersecurity resilience, etc. And then those get adopted in standards like elsewhere. And then the standards can have a different cadence of updates compared to the strategy, etc. And it works really well. India, BIS has been quite... the earlier white paper I mentioned from Certain was about SBOM, which is a technical standard. And it should not be under the ambit of Certain to, like, as they can just put out a white paper and say, hey, we like this thing, but they cannot come up and say, hey, this is how the Indian standard for SBOM should look like, or whether the existing standards already exist and they are fairly good, so we should just adopt one, for example. BIS has been very quiet. But yeah, I will stop now. Thank you for listening to my rant about how India's supply chain security landscape looks like. Any questions? Yes.
So not all vulnerabilities are same, right?
Yes.
I think we don't need to rush and fix 100 things.
Yes.
We look at it from the lens of exploitability.
Yes.
Exploitability. So after as bomb Vex is coming into picture, vulnerability. So what are your thoughts?
I am a Vex skeptic, so I'll explain the question first. So this question is not all vulnerabilities are equal. Some are exploitable, and one of the ways we discussed earlier was via KEVs, where we know these vulnerabilities are exploited. But it's hard for humans and machines to actually, because there's such a huge stream of vulnerabilities, and you might be impacted or not impacted depending on how you use that piece of software. So there's this new standard called Vex, which essentially tries to give you a machine-readable document of trying to help you figure out whether a vulnerability is exploited and how you're using it or not. Uh, but I feel like that a lot of the majority of CVs are for open source software, and Vex is asking a lot of free labor from the open source ecosystem in order to, for example, I as an open source developer will now suddenly be liable to not just issue CVs and say, hey, this piece of software was vulnerable, but to also issue a new document that signs and attests and says, hey, my piece of software is, if you're using this in this ways, you're vulnerable. If you're using this in this ways, you're not vulnerable, and so on. I think it is just too much free labor that will not happen unless some coordination happens, etc. And so I'm a Vex skeptic currently.
What about reproducible Vex? How they?
I think outside the ambit of this place, we can take this offline. All right, I will stop now and we can move on to the next talk. Thank you, everyone.